All right, welcome to the lecture on Fast Food Nation, which I'm framing as the industrialization or industrialized food. It's by Eric Schlosser. It was originally published in 2001. This is a newer edition. He also has a book out about the history of the way the U.S. government and military has organized and executed our nuclear defense policy, and it contains all kinds of scary stories where we almost blew ourselves up. So that's supposed to be a very good book as well. Okay, so I want to give you some breadcrumbs to pay attention to as you go throughout the book. He's very good at giving you lots of very specific data points that by the end kind of give you a coherent picture, but I want to give you this frame ahead of time so you can kind of pay attention to them. So one of the things to pay attention to is the extent to which food production has become industrialized. So you see the Industrial Revolution, one of our key themes of modernity, continuing to turn out new innovations, and as the technology advances, that causes all kinds of changes in the power relations between individual producers and consumers, and you get the rise of these large behemoth corporations that take advantage of these new technologies. So power relations to pay attention to, public versus private. So in other words, one classic one is, what's the public health demand that we want from a system that produces food, and then to what extent do we want to let just private interests do whatever they want, market whatever they want to whomever they want. There's also this, it's clear you see that there's a lot of public investments that made a lot of these private companies possible. So in the West, irrigation and other things. He's pointing that out because typically you get arguments from these large corporations that they just want the free market to work. But if you look at the history, they've been intimately dependent upon government interventions at different points to get their start. Then you also see this phenomenon where there are these power concentrations, the oligopolies that emerge, where you have just a small number of buyers, and you see this in different industries, from chicken to beef to potatoes. And you see the way in which one large company like McDonald's can really transform entire food systems. All right, so obviously I've mentioned this already, but corporations is a huge lens that we're looking through. And recognize corporations are a relatively recent intervention, where these legal entities that have some of the same rights and abilities as people, but they sometimes don't have the same accountability that people do. And you see that both in terms of fast food industries themselves, so Burger King, McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, etc., and then also the agribusinesses that are positioned between the producers and the different companies that sell food to people. So there's a certain corporate logic that we've seen before that tends to be reductive and instrumental. They're going to do things that advance the shareholder interest. There's consistent demand for and typically more and more deregulation, so that corporations are unleashed or untethered from any kinds of laws that restrict what they can do. And you see corporations versus the workers or growers, tensions there, and corporations versus public health. So there's a lot of dark stuff here, but it is pretty amazing the efficiency with which corporations can move product and get it into, move different kinds of things that are grown or raised, and then convert them into products that we eat. That whole system is fairly amazing about the diversity of things that they can give us at a pretty low price. All right, and then one of my favorite things in the book is just he gives you such a sense of how all these different kinds of systems are related. How we think about food, how we produce food, the governmental roles, the roles of technology, the changes that have occurred over time. So really pay attention to how things connect as you go through the book. All right, so just an overview. We're going to do chapters 1, 2, 3, and 5, and we're just covering the parts that I ask you to read of those. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the obesity epidemic and some of the more recent research on that. So we've got the Founding Fathers, which basically gives you the historical kind of angle. Your Trusted Friends, which is about how they market the products, especially to children. Behind the Counter is about the workers that are in the fast food restaurants and how they're treated. And then why the fries taste so good, he really talks about how one product, French fries, has evolved in the technology that makes it possible, and the extent to which it may no longer really be a food in the true sense of the term, given how much technology and modification and flavoring is used to produce it. And then finally, like I said, we'll talk about the obesity epidemic and its relation to marketing. Okay, so the Founding Fathers. One note on this is a book that's seeking a popular audience, so it's a little creative in the way it terms things. So Founding Fathers kind of has two meanings. One is Schlosser's trying to understand the whole U.S. experiment in terms of one industry, that is fast food. So he's trying to make a gesture towards the extent to which these are like, instead of thinking about the Founding Fathers as being Thomas Jefferson and his homies, the Founding Fathers really being these guys that had this business idea and built this empire. But given that he's being a little creative with his titles, you kind of need to read into to get a sense of the structure of the book, what he's talking about. So when you see Founding Fathers, he's talking about the historical origins of this industry. All right. So one thing that's really fascinating is it comes out of a specific milieu, and milieu means like a certain social situation, or you could even think about it as an ecosystem, because the climate and the culture and all of that of Southern California is really important in understanding where this stuff comes from. So it starts in Southern California in the 1940s, kind of post-war. So America's on this kind of high. They're excited that some of the restrictions of the war are gone. So, for example, there was restrictions on rubber that was used to make tires. So a lot of that's gone, and the industry had really ramped up to meet war demand, and so now it can change to other things like producing cars and suburban homes. So a lot of pent-up demand and excitement about the future. Southern California also has the perfect climate to support kind of a year-round drive-in car-based kind of lifestyle. So you have this flat, open expanse of fairly dry land, and you don't have a lot of existing infrastructure there in terms of buses and trains and that kind of stuff. So what the climate, the era, and the landscape, all of it really sets the stage for this rapid growth in this car-based industry, which is fast food. He does do a lot to show you the government spending that went in to make this possible. So two big things. You had the two big things I'll talk about in a second, but basically the irrigation and the working out the ways to get water to this really dry region. And then also the defense industry, which was just huge coming out of World War II and ramping up for the Cold War. So when you think about the car culture, think about it as an infrastructure of consumption. So it's a certain technology and a certain system that it calls forth and brings into being this whole kinds of way of thinking about food on the go and quick and convenience and something you could eat in the car, all that kind of stuff. There's also this heavy element of a youth culture where kids are trying to get out away from their parents. They want to do what's hip and what's new, and this idea of fast food has this kind of sexy appeal that some older kinds of things didn't. So you get this whole drive-in infrastructure that's built up. So you get a bunch of new freeways. You get these drive-in diners where you have car hops that come out and serve you, and you can stay in your car. You have these motels, that's with an M as opposed to a hotel. So the M is focused on the car. So there's a whole industry of motels that came into being once you had more people getting around the country on these new roads and in cars. And then we here have some of the Founding Fathers, the McDonald's brothers that started off. And as you read, they were the ones that kind of had the initial idea. They came up with the speedy service thing, but it was Ray Kroc that really took it and made it a national empire. Okay, so here's just a promotional postcard for California and all the romantic highways and roads that you can drive on. You can see the car culture here in the dressed up bellhops coming out to serve you, trying to make it kind of a fun experience. And then They had drive-in movie theaters, which preachers started using to do drive-in churches, and this was really the beginning of the mega churches. It was a whole new kind of way of doing religion that started in Southern California. Okay, so there's this tension between public and private, and there's these implicit conflicts between the we, are we all in this together, or is it just about me, the I? This is something that we've seen come out of the themes of modernity, the moral sources of modernity, so the instrumental individualism, the expressive individualism, and that plays out in terms of who's responsible for the infrastructure. So there was this huge federal spending, like I mentioned, on irrigation and defense spending, and there was this conflict over how people should get around. So there was this trolley system that had some problems and probably would have died off anyway, but GM came in and bought up parts of it along with some other people that benefited from the car industry, and they kind of forced the city to convert to cars. So one of the problems that trolleys had is they had to pay for their own track. But with roads were taken on as the responsibility of the local government that were paid through taxes. So that's a really big deal, that the car manufacturers, cars they're not really competing on a fair playground relative to trolleys. If trolleys have to pay for their infrastructure and cars can offload that onto local governments. So there's a big way in which car manufacturers and all those that benefit from automobile sales aren't really paying the full cost, because we, the people, have to pay for the roads. And so anybody that doesn't own a car, doesn't take advantage of the roads, is really subsidizing those of us that do. All right. And then another theme you'll see in Schlosser stuff, and it's in lots of places, but the kind of political ethos of the West is that just leave us alone. We don't need the government getting in the way. But if you look at it closely, they are intimately dependent upon the government, especially the federal government, and the West has had a whole lot more government spending than some other regions. So, for example, from early on, the railroads, the government investment to get those off the grounds, the interstates, the defense spending, irrigation, all that. There's been a lot of government investment to make the West work. Okay, so one of the fun things here is you see the Industrial Revolution continuing to spin its way out. So you had Henry Ford with the assembly line that made Model Ts, that made cars something that the average individual could afford. The speedy service model that McDonald Brothers came up with really took the same principles of industrial design, where you simplify, you automate, and you make it as efficient as possible, and applied that to food. So some of the key things they did is they made the menu as simple as possible, and that meant there was less things they had to manage, and they could fire all their short order cooks. They could also fire all their car hops, the people that served the cars, because they made the customers help out and do their own self-service. So everything becomes disposable, so you don't have dishwashers, so you don't have utensils. Everything's designed to be eaten by hand and even eaten in the car. So there's this huge de-skilling that we've seen in other industries, outsourcing to the cheapest possible way of doing something, in this case having the customer do it themselves. And you see this transformation or echoes of an earlier era, where if the classic American meal had been something like steak and potatoes, now that gets transformed into a hamburger and fries. But the benefit is that you don't have to have a knife and fork, so it becomes car friendly, becomes mobile friendly. There is this also, there's a lot of dark sides, but it's hard to deny that this kind of service model opens up restaurant eating to a lot of people that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. So there's really, you could frame this as it's a way of democratizing restaurants, making it accessible to the working class. And so you see a lot of corporations having this defense. Walmart, it's a classic defense that Walmart has, is they give you a lot of good stuff at cheap prices. All right, so chapter 2, Schlosser really digs into the extent to which corporations are a little sneaky in how they're presenting themselves. So the classic line is that there was this secret memo that the brand should appear as a trusted friend. So the irony, of course, is it was a secret memo, but everything about the McDonald's marketing per se is trying to get you to see them not only as a place you can eat, but like they have your back. They are a friend that you can trust. And he specifically highlights the extent to which they're trying to hook kids. So we have here just some examples of this kind of marketing. You've got the Burger King Kids Club that was at least around when I was growing up. You have Ronald McDonald, the clown, right? So obviously designed to appeal to pretty young kids, right? He's not he hardly even talks. He's typically just around showing that he's happy and he's at McDonald's. You got the Happy Meal, which gets the branding and the colors in a portable box that the kid can contain and own. And there's this thing where you're trying to make kids realize that McDonald's is fun. So you have this big smile on the box. And you notice that the smile kind of echoes the arches. So a lot of thought went into the design of that. And then on the darker side, you have Joe Camel. So when you look at another industry that's not necessarily good for people, tobacco, they picked a representative of the brand that was designed as a cartoon figure that could kind of appeal to kids. Now they would deny it, but in some of the litigation that came out of the tobacco wars, you found that kids really recognized Joe Camel, and it's hard to imagine that wasn't part of the idea in having a cartoon character representing their product. Okay, so they're really focused on kids as customers, in part because they know if they can hook kids when they're young, they're really going to get loyalty later on. Also, if you get kids to want to go to McDonald's, they can pull in their parents. So the kids are kind of the key to getting in the whole family and making it something that's part of that family's way of doing things. There's also this, from an evolutionary perspective, we know that things that are more familiar, things that we get used to when we're kids, are going to stick with us and be very popular as we get older. Okay, so another big thing to notice here is that it's not as if it's a fair fight. If you want to say parents can make choices about what foods their kids eat, because there's a huge amount of money and sophistication that goes into how corporations are trying to manipulate and cultivate kids as customers. So I talked about there was the secret memo about how to position the brand and the way they're trying to position it as your trusted friend. There's research on how kids should nag parents, and there's different kinds of nags. And the firm all along, McDonald's all along, really, any kind of firm wants to associate the brand they have with some kind of universal values. So if you think about Nike, for example, Nike is all about this really simplistic message that you can do it. Like you're going to reach glory by having the right products, and you can have some of the glory that Michael Jordan has and these other elite athletes have by wearing their gear and living in that world. McDonald's is trying to sell some universal values related to safety and fun. So in almost all their messages, you can see there's this kind of warm embrace that's very non-judgmental, that offers you this safe place to go and meet people that are like you and just live and enjoy yourself. The food is also clearly an angle, and they're selling it because it tastes good, but there's also this more soft kind of stuff about safety and fun. Schlosser talks about the sophistication that these marketers use. So there's like the character appeal quadrant analysis. So they put a lot of thought into what kind of characters they want representing their food. There's these special clubs like the Burger King Kids Club or the Ronald McDonald House. Gives you the idea that it's associated with family and belonging. So a lot of deep psychological evolved mechanisms are getting triggered there. And they want to give you these special friends. So like Ronald McDonald is this adult special friend that cares about you. And you can tell there's a dark side here in that they want you to understand Ronald is the ultimate authority on everything. So if Ronald loves you and cares about you and he's fit and healthy and he wants you to come see him at McDonald's, that's quite a pull for a kid. Okay, and then you can see it this, I always think it's cute and scary at the same time. But Ronald is sitting here. He wants you to be his friend. There's this physical manifestation of this idea that you are welcome at McDonald's by putting Ronald on a park bench. And in this day and age, there's also a sense that this makes for a great kind of social media post. So you can see there's a lot of sophistication behind this marketing approach. Okay, and then what does the Ronald McDonald House do to promote the brand? So what I would suggest is it's hitting some of their key themes about Ronald and kids and taking care of kids and providing parents a place to stay when their kids are in the hospital. You might notice that they're careful to avoid the health consequences of their menu by focusing on providing health care to kids. So if they were providing health care to or some supplementary services to let adults access health care, you have to deal with the fact that many of the adult health care problems, the reason they're in the hospital to start with is because they're overweight, and that would then shine kind of a untoward light on the products that they're selling. So there's various benefits for sticking with kids. All right, so just a quick exercise here. Can you identify some of these brands? I'll give you just a second to think through that. Okay, so at least I can identify Coca-Cola, Taco Bell, McDonald's, Pizza Hut, Burger King, Subway, Starbucks. I think this is Sprite, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Gatorade, and I'm not sure about this one. I'm not sure about that one. But the fact that I know those suggests that the marketing overall is so ubiquitous that I can just get a little glimpse of a logo and I know who it is because I've seen it so many times. I think this might be Little Debbie. I'm still not sure about this one. Okay, so there's a political angle you could put on this. So one of the things I'd point out is by focusing on kids and fun, it kind of depoliticizes it. So you don't notice that there's an agenda behind it. But there's political stuff going on. So one thing is there's less willingness in lots of localities to spend money on or to tax people to provide infrastructure like playgrounds. So what happens? The private interests step into the void and they offer these playgrounds that are for kids that are attached to their restaurants. So that might sound great that you don't have to pay for it as a community, but you're creating a situation where there's this huge lure, there's this playground that's attached to this place that gives you food that's not so good for you. So, and then Schlosser also talks about back in the day, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, tried to restrict ads to kids, and they just got clobbered. So other countries, some of the Scandinavian countries, don't allow you to advertise to kids under 12, but in the U.S., they're fair game. And I think if I remember right, the politicians that tried to advance that got clobbered and got voted out of office. So we've made a decision implicitly in the U.S. that it's okay to market bad stuff to kids, and we're just going to chalk it up to the freedom of the market and not worry about it. You see the excesses of this with the baby bottles that have different soft drink labels. So Diet Pepsi here. And some people sometimes believe that this really happened, but there was actually research on the effect of it. So a 1997 study found that people that had these bottles that had the soda logos on them were 4 times more likely to give their kids soft drinks in their baby bottles. And anybody who has been kind of informed about child health and nutrition knows that giving soft drinks to a baby who's got developing teeth and all that kind of stuff is setting them up for a big problem later on. Then you look at the populations that are most directly affected by that: Black and Hispanic ethnic groups, younger folks, and people without a high school diploma. So in other words, it's kind of preying on people that maybe are from the kind of backgrounds that haven't had the kind of education about what's good for their kids. And I would just suggest that a company that's willing to do that probably doesn't have your best interest at heart. Okay, and then we also, Schlosser's good about showing how the fast food industry, given its interest in kids, has really worked hard to co-opt schools and the whole school system. So again, we have this idea that schools aren't funded at the levels they should be because we're not willing to tax, we're not willing to invest in the public good. So that sets them up to be preyed upon by the private sector. So you can have vending machines and Coke. And the dark reality is the schools are strapped for cash, and this provides another cash flow. And oftentimes it's money that they can kind of use at their own discretion. So in Winthrop's history, we had a president that used vending machine sales to buy football tickets for board members, and it was later chastised by some agency overseeing Winthrop's finances, as that's not a good thing to do. But it's basically a slush fund where they can use it for things that they might not otherwise have funds for. Okay, so the company wants to access to the schools because it's a current market. It's also a future market. It's getting brand loyalty. And schools will push beverage sales. They'll do different kinds of promotions where you sell certain kinds of products and you normalize junk food. So I've got, I don't know why that's had my graphics messed up here, but and also so M&Ms will do workbooks that have math you can do with M&Ms. Hershey will do fundraisers, and Chick-fil-A and other companies do spirit nights where you raise funds. So there's this way in which they're really trying to inject their brands and their idea of what nutrition is into a school education that kind of normalizes and makes accessible stuff that is probably not good for us. Okay, and then when we get to behind the counter, chapter 3, Schlosser's looking at what's the work environment like for McDonald's employees and others. So he points out some ironies that on the one hand, they are actively trying to de-skill the environment as much as possible so that you can put in somebody that will work for very low wages and they can't command a higher salary because you've made the work so simple. Also, it gives them the chance, it makes it easier to accommodate high turnover. So if the employees don't stay there that long, in some ways that has some advantages because then they're less likely to try to get organized and get a union. So that kitchen redesign can keep pay low. But at the same time, they are bilking the government for these funds that they get because they're apparently doing job training. So there's an irony there in that they're really not training that many skills, but they're still getting paid for it. And there's also this, what I would call like a dark paternalism, where they're kind of take on the role of a parent and they want you to be a good employee. Obedience is highly prized. But at the same time, they don't really treat you that well. There's more minimum wage pay than in any other industry in fast food. Here and in other low wage jobs, you get pressured to do work off the clock or else they'll fire you or give you bad hours. One of the things they can do in this kind of environments is since you're not full-time, they can always cut your hours. It's a way of retaliating or punishing employees where it hurts them the most, and yet it's so variable and the reasons why your hours might get cut are ambiguous, so it gives the employers a lot of power. And the reason you're not getting full-time, obviously, is because if you were full-time, you would have to get benefits, and they don't want to make that investment in their employees. And Schlosser also talks about all the union busting work that corporations do, where they have the special rapid response teams that fly in and administer lie detector tests and try to identify who the key union organizers are so they can fire them and do other stuff that's actually illegal, but lots of that stuff doesn't get enforced. And so that they've been very successful in preventing unions from forming because there's a ton of research, academic research, that unions do a pretty good job at raising wages, and they are very effective. So there's some bad press that they get for different kinds of things, but the empirical research suggests that people that are in unions do get paid more. And Schlosser also details some drastic tactics that you'll get. And one thing they've done is in Lansing, Michigan, and this I've heard about this in other places too, but if some place does get unionized, they'll figure out a reason to shut down that specific building or that specific outlet, and they'll just build another one someone else nearby. So if you're willing to do that kind of stuff, it's pretty hard to bust in there. I will make one other just observation. I challenge you to do a Google search of McDonald's work and find pictures where you have employees that don't look happy. My suspicion is that they are very savvy about what gets on the internet and who can come in and take pictures in their stores. So it's hard to find any pictures of or photos of people that where the environment doesn't look clean or where somebody doesn't look happy. And my suspicion is that speaks to the kind of power they have over managing the message and the control they have. All right, so there has been some progress on the pay front for minimum wage. There's a movement called the Fight for 15 that's been pressing for a higher minimum wage in lots of different industries. In New York, they've actually been successful in getting legislation where the hourly pay rate will go to $15 an hour in 2022. The research that's happened, by the way, on increases in minimum wage and unemployment, it largely shows that there's no impact. They've done studies where you have a minimum wage that goes up in one state and not in the state next door, and they can do this nice little comparison between the two, and it always shows that there's not an impact on unemployment. So some of the scary stuff people tell you about why we can't raise the minimum wage doesn't play out when you look at the empirical evidence. Okay, so this is what's going on in 2020. Member Schlosser wrote this in 2001, so it's amazing how much is still the same. So you get the same issues of repression. People that are pro-union as employees will get their hours cut, or they'll retaliate in other different ways. They'll also, one of the things that the union organizers are most, one of the issues besides pay is the kind of working conditions that people have. One of the things that they will do is they don't pay you to work full time, but yet they expect you to be available to work at any time they want, which makes it really difficult for low wage employees to get educated, to go to college so they can work their way up, or to get childcare because they're at the mercy of a scheduler who does not always keep promises about trying to work with employees about what hours they're scheduled. Okay, and it's important to see that all this economic stuff is nested into a political economy. And what I mean by that is the rights that workers have to organize are dependent upon the government having their back. And it makes a difference what administration is in office, whether or not the employees get the benefit of the doubt or whether the employers get the benefit of the doubt. So most recently what's happened is McDonald's, in order to avoid lawsuits, has run the position that, or adopted the position that it's their franchisees, the people that actually own the individual businesses and specific buildings in specific towns. It's those franchisees that are responsible for setting wages, not McDonald's, the corporation. And so they said, you can't sue us for this and other issues. So in the Obama administration, the National Labor Relations Board, who manages this stuff, had ruled that they could go after McDonald's, the corporation. Trump's National Labor Relations Board has decided that they can't do that. So, and just an interesting side note, but corporations were originally designed in part to protect owners from liability. So a corporation could be liable for something, but the people that own the corporation wouldn't be liable for that. So LLCs, you've probably heard that term after the name of a certain company or whatever. That means a limited liability corporation. So it's important to realize that there are these entities out there called corporations, and that there's these social constructions that have certain rights but may not have the same responsibilities that other people do, other actual people do. All right, chapter 5. Just so you don't get confused, we didn't read chapter 4 in the book. So Roman numeral 4, the fourth section in this lecture, is covering chapter 5. But the topic is why the fries taste so good. In a word, food processing. We'll talk about the flavor design later, but Schlosser's trying to dig into this one particular product, give you a sense of where it came from, the changes over time, why it's so profitable, etc. So Simplot is the guy pictured down here, who is the potato kingpin based in Aberdeen, Idaho. So Schlosser runs through a number of ways in which this young guy, when he was starting out, took advantage of a number of government programs or government spending to kind of get his start. So there was the Snake River Reclamation Project, which should be a theme you're picking up on here, is the West is pretty dry. And so you need to have these irrigation systems and programs, which are expensive, in order to make the land usable for farming. So Simplot took advantage of that. He also bought these scripts, which are like IOUs from teachers. He bought them for 50 cents on the dollar and sold them to banks at 90 cents on the dollar, and made a killing doing some arbitrage there. He also, when he needed it, chopped down trees at Yellowstone to get lumber, which may not have been legal, given that Yellowstone is a national forest. And he also had these lucrative World War II contracts to supply the troops with potatoes. So in many ways benefited from government spending. And then the point is that many of these folks, when it comes to government regulations, are very much free market advocates, but they oftentimes don't acknowledge the extent to which they've benefited from government spending in the past. All right, Schlosser runs through a number of technology innovations that let the French fry develop. So first of all was dehydration, which made it cheaper to ship. And then they finally figured out how to freeze the French fry and bring it out and have it taste as good as if you hadn't frozen it. And they also took advantage of, after World War II, lots of refrigeration technologies really blossomed. And so the commercial places could get this stuff in already processed, already cut into French fries, and all they have to do is drop it into the fryer. They don't have to pay somebody to cut up all those potatoes. So they really cut the labor costs, and they make it very profitable. Okay, and in a second we'll talk about the other technology, which is putting the flavor back in after you've done all this stuff to manipulate the potato that gets the flavor out of it. They have to have a technology to make it taste good, and we'll get to that in a second. But before that, we're going to run through some implications in terms of the power and the politics of this. So Schlosser introduces us to the term oligopsony, which means it's a market where there's just a few buyers but a lot of sellers. So what happens when there's just a few buyers is they can really drive down the prices because there's only a few places you can go to sell your product. You're kind of at the mercy of what the buyer is going to offer you. And so what happens is the profits get shifted from farmers to the agricultural businesses that are buying the potatoes, and then the fast food chains that they sell them to. There's also typically a lot of collusion among the processors, because if you just have a few people that you need to set prices with, you can really make a killing. So lots of ag businesses have been caught colluding. We'll see some evidence of that later. And specifically, I have here, you'll see that with the beef buyers. There's just a few beef buyers. The beef buyer market has been consolidated, is the word, and it produces these oligopsony kind of conditions. So Schlosser points out that at least in 2001 dollars, farmers would get 2 cents for every $1.50 spent on an order of fries. So the actual grower is getting very little of the product. It's mostly these large corporations that are owning that profit. And he also points out there's this other phenomenon going on called the fallacy of composition. And that is that it seems like something that is in your interest to do will produce benefits for you, but it doesn't if in the composition of all the other actors in the systems, it only keeps you in the same place you were. So it's a bit like running on the treadmill. You're working really hard just to stay in place. So what happens is farmers will hear about a new technology that makes it more efficient. They'll adopt that technology, and they'll grow even more potatoes for the same amount of money, and think they're going to get ahead. But everybody does that. So the productivity eventually drives more and more farmers off the land, because fewer and fewer people can raise the same number of potatoes, and that shifts the balance of power to the buyers, and makes those growers more beholden to the companies. Again, we'll see this when we get to cattle and beef and how those markets work. He draws on William Heffernan, an economist that has this interesting hourglass metaphor. So it's not in terms of time, but it's in terms of shape. So at the top, you have all these ranchers and farmers that are growing stuff. And then at the bottom, you have all these consumers that are buying food. But it's just a few large corporations in the middle that really have the power. And this is where they can extract these large profits, such that the consumers really aren't seeing the benefits, and the ranchers and the farmers aren't seeing the benefit, but the shareholders are. And just to educate you, one company like Conagra is a large food conglomerate. They can have hundreds of different kinds of brands under them. So everything from Swiss Miss to Hunt's to Chef Boyardee to Bird's Eye vegetables. All of these are made by the same company, and they just have these different brands that they promote. So it's kind of deceiving how many players there are in the market. Okay, and then getting back to French fries, the French fry design is shaped by the flavor technology industry, and so that's why I have this set of test tubes, because the flavor is largely artificial. So going back, talking about the cooking, he observes that, ironically, initially this vegetable product was cooked mostly in beef tallow, and that it had more fat per ounce than a hamburger, and then switched to vegetable oil in the 1990s. But the interesting thing here is the technology that they use to make the French fry taste the way it does. So all this processing that they do to food removes the flavor, and so they turn to chemicals that are produced on the New Jersey Turnpike to put these flavors back in. And the IFF plant that is producing the taste for McDonald's is located right next to a plastics factory and a cosmetics factory. So the same people that are making perfume are making your hamburger and your French fries taste a certain way. So they'll use what's called natural flavoring, but Schlosser points out that's really a misnomer, in that these are all kind of man-made additives, and the fact that it's natural flavoring just means they get the chemicals abstracted in a natural way, but all the chemicals that are put together are by no means natural. And you can't tell exactly what's in them because the companies don't want to share their secret formulas, so there's this designation of GRAS, generally recognized as safe, which means you can just say, oh, it's in that category, and you don't have to say to the consumer exactly what it is. And Schlosser goes through this great vignette where he's taking these different pieces of paper and tasting them, and he's or just smelling them, and he's having these very powerful different sensations of seeing different food right in front of him, and it's all just chemical magic that's produced by these artificial chemicals. Few other notes here. He notes that smell can have this really powerful hold on people. So those of us that had good childhood memories around Happy Meals oftentimes become the heavy adult users of fast food because it's comfort food. That smell that we remember from childhood takes us back, makes us feel secure, and so we eat stuff that's probably not good for us. And then he also talks about the state-of-the-art machine for cutting fries, the lamb water gun knife. And I found some videos online of this. It's pretty impressive. But the important thing to notice is this, like many other things, the Industrial Revolution continues, and the natural world gets more and more defined by exactly our specific preferences, and we can automate these processes, and they become less and less natural, and less labor is involved, so you have fewer jobs and all that kind of thing. All right, then our fifth and final thing for this part of the lecture is the obesity epidemic. Schlosser doesn't go into this, but I think this is a nice chance for us to think about the marketing that he does talk about with fast food, how that affects the ways that we live our lives and the kind of lives that we have. So obesity has taken off drastically in the U.S. If you go back and look here, this is 1991 and up to 2008, 2010, you can see that the percentage of people in each state, in general, it's a fairly consistent pattern, has gone up drastically in terms of the percent that are obese. So back in the day, it was around 10 or 15%, and now it's pushing 25 30 or greater than 30%. You see here, I think orange is greater than 35%. And you've got this swath of Appalachia and extended Appalachia down into Texas, where you have some mighty large people. So thinking systemically, these changes, there's evidence that they occurred starting in the 70s and 80s in most high-income countries. And so we need to find something that explains that, that's not just specific to the U.S. And so you can read different experts and they talk about, well, maybe it's city design and how walkable neighborhoods are. That doesn't quite fit the data. Or they talk about exercise, but that doesn't quite fit the data in terms of this distinct sharp thing that started happening in the 70s and 80s. So for example, there's been many labor-saving devices that started back in the 30s and 40s. Those didn't cause the increase in obesity. It's not until we get like to the 70s and 80s that it starts. So anyway, so one study looked at it worldwide, what's going on in different countries, and they found between 1980 and 2015, the obesity rates doubled in 73 countries. And in the ones that it didn't double, it mostly increased. And another study found that most of this began concurrently in the different high-income countries in the 70s and the 80s. And this is another just U.S. study, but what's showing here is that going back to starting in you see the 1960s, it's pretty flat, but then here in the 70s and 80s, it starts to really take off, and it takes off among women and men and among different age cohorts. So you need an effect that is pretty broad in terms of you need a causal agent that can explain this really broad effect across the world and across different ages, across different genders. And what many people come down to is the marketing. It's the corporate power that has become a lot more efficient and effective in terms of pushing these products and getting you to eat in a certain way. So this is from a mainline journal, 2011, talking about the marketing muscle of these corporations. And I'll just run through a few of the specific things that they do. So one, there's this technique of value meal bundling. So you've seen this in a McDonald's or whatever. You walk in and there's these different value meals where you get some combination of a few things for a cheaper price. And what they're trying to do is get you to think about the price and how much money it is and not think about the calories per se. There's something about the way mentally it works. If you're buying this whole set of things for a certain price, that grabs your attention more than thinking about, if I buy this and I buy this and I buy this, how many calories I'm getting. Combining them gets you to think about the overall price as opposed to the calories. The other thing they do is they've increased portion sizes. So that's an easy thing to manipulate. Oftentimes the cost is not in the food itself, so it's easy to make that bigger, make it seem like a better value. There's some research that suggests that people will supersize things or get bigger portions of things because it makes them feel slightly more important or having a slightly higher status. And you'll have other techniques about putting this stuff in schools and in-school advertising, a bunch of product placements in movies and TVs, sponsorships where trusted figures that young people might know, sports stars that are recommending different kinds of products, and you've got packaging that's designed to catch your eye and distract from the calories, etc. There's some research in particular on how the food industry responds to this. There's what's called, basically there's a bunch of blame shifting, and the key thing that they try to do is suggest that it's a problem that people aren't active enough. It's not the food they're eating, it's not the junk we're eating, it's that we're not active enough. So we have this line here, if all the consumers exercised, obesity wouldn't exist. You have organizations like Coca-Cola. They wanted to start this offshoot agency that they could support that would really push the message that the obesity is about the amount of exercise that people get. They wanted to change the conversation, so they don't talk about the food, which they don't want to. Obviously, they have profits tied to. They don't want to change. They want to change it to exercise, and so there's this phenomenon that is called lean washing, which is analogous to greenwashing, is a company that doesn't really have good environmental practices but wants to look like it does. Lean washing is companies that are trying to promote themselves as concerned about health, and they're really not. So if you want to learn some more about this, there's some great explainer videos at nutritionfacts.org. This guy's very good at showing you the different research articles that he's drawing on to make the claims that he does. But he's pretty good, and the public health literature is pretty clear that these food companies are working in a way to promote stuff that's making us fat. Okay, there's some other sources of this information. Another outfit, I forget, they're either at the University of Connecticut or Yale, but they're pointing out here that you have some $4.6 billion spent per year in 2012 to promote fast food, telling people it's fun, it's easy, it's cheesy, let's treat yourself. And then the amount of money spent on promoting fruits and vegetables is tiny. $116 million is all. So but the point is here, it's not really a fair fight if you're asking parents to make good choices and you have this much money spent on advertising the fast food and just this much spent on promoting the good stuff. Similarly, you can look at television ads. So 2 to 5 year olds are watching a lot of television, maybe watching Nickelodeon, and the companies typically say, no, we're not advertising to young kids. That's not what we do. But when you look at the TV ads, that's exactly what they do. This is the Rudd Center at Yale that has some good information. All right. So the short answer is, one of the key points here is the marketing is inescapable. Like our society, you're just marinated in all this stuff. So if you're just going to the grocery store, you'll go through the checkout aisle, which has this candy and stuff at a kid's eye level. And it's brands that we all know and have seen many, many times and have positive relationships with or positive associations with. Think about Halloween and all the candy that all those brands that kids love. And they are always innovating. They are taking new stars and new people to endorse these different kinds of products. They have video games that kids can play that are based on different brands. The huge presence in social media, and you can have hashtag campaigns where people are sharing stuff, so they're really getting other people to do their work for them. But when you're selling Cocoa Krispies and you're arguing that it's increasing people's immunity, you're probably telling people some stories. And I have here, most of us probably recognize this as a Lunchable. So a Lunchables is this hip kind of way to package stuff that makes it a little sexier than just a peanut butter sandwich that your mom makes you. But there's some status that kids get from pulling out the more processed food kind of attractive packaging at the lunch counter. So it's really hard to it's really hard to escape this in our society. So the big ecological psychology takeaway is, I would suggest it's hard to conceptualize modern Western psychology and some of the major problems we face without considering the role of the corporate form. So we take corporations for granted. They're a relatively recent invention, and they have the legal properties of people, but not necessarily the ethical senses of people. And from at least many perspectives, they're designed to do one thing, which is to maximize shareholder value. And anytime you have that kind of narrow, reductive logic, it's very likely they're going to engage in different kinds of deception and manipulation in order to maximize that shareholder value, maybe not in a way that's good for the consumer. So we've seen at least 3 examples of this now. We've talked about how the Scott's company markets more fertilizer than you could ever need for your yard, and how that leads to eutrophication and other kinds of problems. We talked about oil companies like Chevron funding different global warming denialism groups, and also trying to have a marketing campaign that suggests that they're in favor of addressing global warming, but it's in terms of you making better choices. So some of that shifting the blame stuff. And now we see with the obesity epidemic, this huge problem that we have with kids that's going to affect healthcare and government spending and healthcare spending for years to come. We can trace it to make a good argument that's coming from corporations that are engaged in different kinds of aggressive marketing tactics. So we're going to look at some of the marketing strategies that McDonald's uses next time. I have some videos that I think you'll find interesting, and specifically look at how they get the attraction of kids. And that is it. So thank you for listening.